In the year 1530, a child was born inside the Kremlin walls. His name was Ivan, son of Grand Prince Vasily III of Moscow and Elena Glinskaya. From the moment he first cried, he carried the destiny of a vast and restless land. But destiny is cruel. When Ivan was only 3 years old, his father died, and the fragile boy was crowned Grand Prince of Moscow. A crown placed upon the head of a toddler was no crown at all. It was an invitation for wolves to circle. His mother, Elena, took power as regent, guarding her son with sharp wit and iron resolve. But even she did not last long. When Ivan was 8, she suddenly sickened and died. Poison, they whispered. And just like that, the boy who was Tsar stood alone in a court of vipers. The boyars, the mighty noble families of Russia, swooped in. They fought one another for control, using the child as their puppet. And while they feasted and schemed, the young prince starved. He was beaten, humiliated, tossed aside like a stray dog. The boy who was meant to rule was treated as less than a servant. But in the shadows, Ivan was learning. He was watching every betrayal, memorizing every insult, burning each slight into his soul. He learned that kindness was weakness, that power was survival, that mercy was a fool's game. As he grew, he became fascinated with cruelty. He plucked feathers from birds, tore small animals apart, and watched with a smile as life left their bodies. This was no childish mischief. It was a reflection. The world had been cruel to him, and he returned cruelty in kind. By his teenage years, Ivan stood tall, pale, with eyes that pierced through men like daggers. And though the boyars still ruled over him, he had begun to plan. Paranoia grew inside him like a shadow that never left. He trusted no one, loved no one, save perhaps his little brother. Everyone else was an enemy. And then, at 13 years old, Ivan struck back. One bitter winter's day, he summoned Prince Andrei Shuaysky, a powerful noble who had mocked him, beaten him, starved him. In front of the entire court, the boy who was Tsar gave his first true command. Shuaysky was thrown to the hunting dogs. The hall echoed with screams as the animals tore the nobleman apart. Ivan did not look away. His pale face remained still, his cold eyes fixed on the spectacle until silence returned. In that moment, Russia understood. The child was no longer prey. He was predator. No longer a victim, but master. The wolves who had raised him had created something far more dangerous than themselves. They had created a boy who believed mercy was weakness, trust was death, and power was everything. The boy who was Tsar had finally shown his teeth. And soon, he would place the crown of all Russia upon his head. The child raised among wolves was ready to become a king, and the world had no idea of the storm that was coming. In January of 1547, Moscow gathered in silence as the boy who had grown among wolves walked into the cathedral of the Dormition. He was only 16 years old, but he was about to make history. No grand prince, no boyar puppet. This day, Ivan placed a new title upon his head. For the first time in Russian history, a ruler would be crowned Tsar of all the Russias. A word born from Caesar itself. A word that declared to his people and to the world, Russia was not just a land of princes, but an empire. The people roared. Bells rang. Incense filled the cathedral as the teenage boy knelt before the altar. He had survived hunger, cruelty, betrayal. And now, cloaked in gold, crowned with the Monomach's cap, he stood not as a victim, but as an autocrat. The first Tsar. Yet, in the years that followed, Ivan showed another side of himself. A side almost forgotten in the shadow of his later terrors. For in his youth, he was not only a tyrant in waiting, he was a reformer. With his beloved wife, Anastasia Romanovna, by his side, Ivan's court softened. For the first time in his life, he knew tenderness. Anastasia's calm voice, her devotion, her quiet wisdom tempered the rage that lived inside him. She was his anchor, and with her, Ivan shone. He began to reshape Russia. A council of chosen advisors was created, men of merit rather than greedy boyars. He reformed laws, modernized the military, and even convened a gathering of representatives from across the land, the very first Zemsky Sobor, a kind of national assembly. The church, too, was strengthened, with the creation of a new code that unified its power. Russia, under Ivan's early rule, grew more stable, more centralized, and stronger than ever before. New fortresses rose. Borders expanded. The Kazan Khanate, once a powerful Tatar stronghold, was crushed by Ivan's armies. In 1552, Russia celebrated a glorious victory as Kazan fell, and Ivan, the once-forgotten boy, rode through the gates as conqueror. It was a triumph that resounded across Europe. The boy who had been beaten and mocked now commanded armies that shattered kingdoms. The people cheered their young Tsar. He was strong, victorious, and, at least for now, just. He ordered the building of St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow, its colorful domes rising to the sky as a symbol of faith and empire. To many, this was the golden dawn of Russia's greatness. But beneath the triumphs, the shadows never truly left him. Ivan's paranoia simmered, always watching, always waiting. Though Anastasia's love calmed the storms within him, the memory of his childhood wounds lingered. He trusted few, feared betrayal at every corner, and believed his destiny was not just to rule, but to rule with absolute power. For a time, though, Russia prospered. The Tsar who would one day be called terrible was, in these years, almost beloved. With Anastasia, he laughed, he prayed, he built. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed as though Ivan might rule not with terror but with greatness. But destiny is cruel, and shadows never rest for long. The victories of the young Tsar would not last. His golden years were fragile, like glass, and soon, the crown that glimmered with promise would grow heavy with blood. For the heart of Ivan the Terrible was never at peace, and when loss struck, the storm inside him would finally break free. The golden years of Ivan's reign did not last. For behind the victories, behind the laughter with his beloved wife Anastasia, behind the soaring domes of St. Basil's Cathedral, shadows still coiled. Shadows that had been waiting since his childhood. And in 1560 they struck. Anastasia fell ill. Her gentle voice grew faint, her strength fading by the day. Ivan, desperate and terrified, prayed for her recovery. She was not only his queen, she was his anchor, the one soul who calmed the storm inside him. And then she was gone. The Tsar was inconsolable. He wept, raged, and prayed, but grief twisted into something darker. Ivan was convinced Anastasia had not died naturally. He believed she had been poisoned by boyars who sought to break him. Perhaps it was true. Perhaps it was only his paranoia. But for Ivan, the truth no longer mattered. His heart had shattered, and with it, the last chains that bound his fury. From that moment, Ivan changed. The Tsar who once spoke of justice and reform now gave way to a creature of suspicion and vengeance. He withdrew from court, refusing to see anyone, brooding in silence. When he emerged, it was with fire in his eyes and cruelty in his hand. The boyars had tormented him as a child. Now, as a man, he would torment them in return. In 1565, Ivan announced a terrifying decree. He declared the creation of a new order, the Oprichnina. He divided Russia into two realms, one ruled by traditional law, the other ruled by his absolute will. Over the second realm, Ivan gave himself total authority, unchecked, unchallenged. And to enforce it, he created his own private army, the Oprichniki. Dressed in black, mounted on black horses, these men rode with the severed heads of dogs hanging from their saddles, symbols of their vow to sniff out treason and tear apart enemies. They became the embodiment of Ivan's paranoia, his vengeance made flesh. Wherever they rode, terror followed. Noble families were dragged from their homes, accused of treason, and executed without trial. Villages were burned, women violated, children slain. Rivers of blood flowed, not from foreign enemies, but from Ivan's own people. The Oprichniki answered only to him, and he wielded them like a weapon against anyone he suspected of disloyalty. Friends, allies, advisors, it did not matter. No one was safe. And yet, Ivan believed he was serving God. He cloaked his terror in religion, presenting himself as God's chosen scourge against sinners. The boy who had grown up surrounded by betrayal now ruled with a conviction that treachery lurked everywhere, and only through fear could he survive. The Oprichnina was not merely a policy. It was a reign of madness. Russia trembled beneath its weight, as neighbor turned against neighbor, and trust vanished like smoke. The young Tsar who had once promised a better Russia was gone. In his place stood Ivan the Terrible, a ruler consumed by grief, twisted by suspicion, and armed with the power to destroy. And as the Oprichniki tightened their grip, Ivan's madness only deepened. The man who had been orphaned, beaten, and starved as a boy now unleashed upon his people the same cruelty he had once endured. The storm had broken free, and Russia would drown in it. The Tsar's paranoia had already bled his people. But Ivan was not content with fear alone. He hungered for glory, for expansion, for conquest. Russia, he declared, would be an empire to rival Rome itself. And so, he turned his eyes to the west. In 1558, Ivan launched the Livonian War, determined to seize control of the Baltic Sea and give Russia access to European trade. At first, the thunder of his armies shook the land. Villages burned, castles crumbled, and Ivan's banners rose high. He dreamed of ports filled with Russian ships, of Moscow transformed into a hub of power that could stare down Poland, Sweden, and even the Holy Roman Empire. But dreams turned to ash. The war dragged on year after year. Sweden struck back, Poland struck harder, and Russia's armies, starved and exhausted, began to crumble. Victory slipped through Ivan's fingers like sand, replaced only with humiliation and rage. And when Ivan raged, Russia bled. The Tsar's suspicion grew wilder, darker. He believed betrayal lurked not just among the boyars but in the very heart of his people. He began to see treason everywhere, and in 1570, his fury fell upon the ancient city of Novgorod. Novgorod had once been a jewel of Russia, a proud city of trade and culture. But Ivan became convinced its citizens had plotted to betray him to his enemies. Whether this was truth or delusion did not matter. What mattered was punishment. The Oprichniki descended upon Novgorod like wolves unleashed. For weeks, the city became a nightmare. Thousands were dragged from their homes, accused of treason, tortured, drowned, burned alive. Priests were slaughtered, churches desecrated, children hurled into icy rivers. The bells of Novgorod tolled not for worship, but for death. By the time Ivan's fury was spent, the city was a graveyard. Tens of thousands lay dead, their only crime the suspicion of their Tsar. And through it all, Ivan believed he was righteous. He believed he was cleansing Russia of traitors, acting as God's scourge upon sinners. But in truth, he was drowning his nation in blood. The Livonian War raged on, draining Russia's strength. Villages starved. Armies fell apart. And while foreign enemies tightened their grip, the Tsar turned his wrath inward, destroying the very people who might have saved his realm. His madness deepened. One day, in a fit of rage, Ivan struck his own son, the heir to the throne. The blow was fatal. As the young man bled in his father's arms, Ivan screamed in horror at what he had done. The Tsar who had dreamed of empire had killed his future with his own hands. Russia, once on the brink of greatness, now stumbled, broken and bleeding, led by a ruler who had become a prisoner of his own demons. Ivan the Terrible had unleashed war and terror upon the world, but the greatest enemy he ever faced was himself. The throne of Russia had grown heavy with blood. Ivan, once a boy crowned too soon, now sat as an old man, his face gaunt, his beard white, his eyes burning with the same paranoia that had haunted him since childhood. The Livonian War had ended in failure. Russia had gained nothing but graves. Its people starved, its armies shattered, its fields burned. And yet, the Tsar still demanded obedience, still saw treachery in every corner. By the 1580s, Ivan's health began to fail. Years of rage, of endless suspicion, of violence had eaten away at him. He suffered fits of madness and moments of despair. He prayed for forgiveness, but never surrendered his cruelty. Even in his last years, executions continued. The Oprichnina, though weakened, still carried out his will. And yet, there were moments when Ivan seemed to see what he had become. He would weep for his dead son, the heir he had struck down with his own hand. He would wander the halls of the Kremlin, muttering to ghosts only he could see. The boy who had once been tormented had grown into the tormentor of an entire nation, and he could not escape the truth. On March 18, 1584, Ivan the Terrible sat down to play a game of chess. His body was weak, his mind clouded, but the Tsar still clung to life as if unwilling to let go of his power. As the pieces moved across the board, he suddenly collapsed. The mad Tsar was dead. He had reigned for 50 years. The first Tsar of Russia, a man who built an empire and nearly destroyed it in the same breath. He expanded Russia's borders, defeated the Tatars, and left behind cathedrals that still rise against the Moscow sky. But he also left behind rivers of blood, mass graves, and a people broken by fear. History remembers him not as Ivan the Great, not as Ivan the Builder, not even as Ivan the Reformer. History remembers him by a single word: Grozny. Terrible. To some, he was God's chosen scourge, a ruler who defended Russia against its enemies and cemented its autocracy. To others, he was a monster, a tyrant whose paranoia drowned his people in suffering. Perhaps he was both. A man shaped by cruelty, who became cruelty itself. A boy who learned from wolves, and who ruled like one until his dying breath. The bells of Moscow rang as his body was laid to rest. But for the people of Russia, the echoes of Ivan's reign would never fade. For he had shown them the terrible price of power unchecked, and the haunting truth that sometimes the greatest danger to a nation is the man who rules it. Ivan IV. Ivan Vasilyevich. Ivan Grozny. Ivan the Terrible. The first Tsar of Russia. The mad Tsar whose shadow still lingers across the centuries. Like the story? Smash that like button, drop a comment, and subscribe to Throne Unknown, where forgotten kings and mad queens live again.